December 22, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. Snow drifted like ash through the freezing air, blanketing the ruins of a town trapped by steel and fire. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded, outgunned, and half-starved, clung to shattered buildings as German artillery thundered from the hills. Somewhere in the silence between explosions, a lone sniper knelt over a rifle that no longer worked as it should. The scope had cracked in the cold, the sight misaligned beyond use. For most men, that meant the fight was over. But this soldier refused to surrender to circumstance. He reached for a fragment of rope, torn from a supply crate, and began to measure, knot, and align. What emerged wasn't regulation issue or battlefield doctrine. It was pure instinct, the kind born only when survival meets invention. That rough rope sight would soon change the course of one impossible standoff and turn a broken weapon into a legend whispered long after the snow melted from Bastogne's fields. December 1944. The Ardennes. The forest lay under a suffocating silence before dawn. Then, on the 16th day of that month, the stillness shattered beneath the roar of thousands of German guns. Hitler's last gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, had begun. More than 200,000 troops, supported by tanks and mechanized columns, surged through the snow-covered valleys of Belgium and Luxembourg. Their goal was audacious: split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Reich collapsed entirely. Caught in the center of that onslaught stood the small crossroads town of Bastogne. It held 7 vital roads, arteries of the Ardennes, and whoever controlled them could control the flow of men and armor. When German panzer divisions punched through thin American lines, they raced to encircle the town. Within days, Bastogne became an island surrounded by steel. Into that frozen pocket moved the 101st Airborne Division, still weary from Holland's failed Operation Market Garden. Trucks carried them through sleet and darkness on December 18th. By the time they arrived, snow had buried the fields waist-deep, and visibility shrank to a few ghostly yards. The paratroopers dug in along the perimeter, Foy, Noville, Marvy, Visory, turning barns and ditches into fighting positions. Supplies were scarce, winter clothing almost non-existent. General Anthony McAuliffe, acting division commander, organized the defense while waiting for the rest of Patton's Third Army to fight north. But until relief came, the men would endure isolation, hunger, and temperatures that froze rations solid. Ammunition dwindled with every counterattack. Each crate of 30 .6 rounds became as precious as food. Amid this siege, the rifles themselves began to suffer. The famous M1 Garand, the soldiers' reliable semi-automatic, jammed when oil congealed. Metal sights iced over, scopes cracked under sudden changes in temperature, and condensation clouded optics faster than they could be wiped clean. For snipers, whose role depended on precision, the cold was an invisible enemy. The unit's sharpshooters, scattered among foxholes, adapted however they could. They kept rifles beneath coats to retain warmth. They wrapped cloth around receivers. They learned to fire between heartbeats when their fingers were too numb for feeling. Still, every malfunction risked a comrade's life. In those conditions, ingenuity became as crucial as ammunition. The German pressure never ceased. Artillery pounded day and night, cutting telephone wires, uprooting trees, and filling the air with splinters of ice and bark. The smell of cordite mixed with pine resin. Civilians huddled in cellars beneath collapsed roofs, while medics converted basements into aid stations lit by candlelight. Yet, morale held, anchored by discipline and the conviction that Bastogne must not fall. By December 24th, the encirclement was complete. German forces, including elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and the elite 2nd Panzer, closed the ring. Reinforcements could no longer enter. Wounded could not leave. The only link with the outside world came from the overcast sky, where C-47 Dakotas braved flak bursts to drop supplies through gaps in the clouds. Some parachutes drifted into German lines, others burst open mid-air. Every crate that landed intact felt like a small miracle. Within that tightening perimeter, small stories of survival unfolded, stories rarely recorded in official reports. One belonged to a marksman whose rifle sight shattered from the cold recoil of a December morning. For him, surrendering accuracy meant surrendering protection for the men beside him. And so, inside a ruined house on the town's edge, he studied the fragments of his weapon, searching for any way to restore its aim. The snow fell harder outside, muffling the front. Inside, the war grew quieter, but no less desperate. That night, Bastogne's defenders received the German demand for surrender. General McAuliffe's famous one-word reply, "Nuts!" echoed through frozen corridors and dugouts, an absurd yet defiant answer that strengthened resolve. The men laughed briefly and returned to their rifles. They understood that the siege would either end in relief or ruin. Amid that tension, the nameless sniper worked by candlelight, a piece of rope across his knees, a damaged weapon before him. Outside, artillery mapped the horizon in flashes. Inside, he planned a solution that no manual could teach, an improvisation that would soon merge ingenuity with survival itself. The siege deepened with every sunrise. By Christmas week, Bastogne had become a frozen tomb surrounded by the German army. Snow clogged the roads, and frost-bitten soldiers shuffled between positions, their breath hanging in the air like smoke. The men of the 101st Airborne, supported by fragments of the 10th Armored Division, now fought without proper medical supplies, fuel, or heavy artillery. Every bullet had to count. In the cellars beneath the town, the 326th Medical Company worked amid the groans of the wounded. The smell of ether and burnt cloth filled the air as surgeons operated with numb hands. Outside, the constant artillery thunder became a grim rhythm of existence. Yet somehow, the paratroopers held the line. Their perimeter stretched only a few miles wide, but within it lived an iron resolve, an understanding that if Bastogne fell, the entire southern flank of the Allied front could collapse. The German forces pressed relentlessly. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the XL-Fabidi Panzer Corps, believed a decisive strike could break the American pocket. His tanks, the feared Panthers and King Tigers, prowled the forest edges, engines idling in the snow. Yet poor terrain and stubborn resistance kept them at bay. The frozen ground favored defense. Each field, each hedgerow, had become a miniature fortress. By December 23, skis finally cleared. Allied aircraft, long grounded by weather, roared overhead in a display of salvation. C-47 transport planes dropped supplies, parachutes bursting open like flowers against the white expanse. Men cheered, waving their helmets as crates thudded into snowdrifts. It was the first breath of hope in days. Yet even with resupply, the suffering continued. Inside the encircled town, soldiers improvised constantly. Helmets became pots for melting snow. Gasoline lamps were fueled with scraps of motor oil. Rifles were cleaned with socks. Every problem demanded invention, and necessity drove creativity to its limits. Among these soldiers were the division's sharpshooters, men trained for patience, precision, and solitude. Their value was immense in the siege. Snipers controlled sight lines through shattered streets, denying German patrols any advance. But equipment failure haunted them. Optics fogged instantly in sub-zero air. The metal rings that held scopes expanded and contracted, throwing aim off by inches, a death sentence at 300 yards. It was in this environment that one sniper's predicament became emblematic of the siege itself. His scope lens had fractured after a nearby explosion. Replacement parts were impossible to find. Even the division's ordnance repairmen were overwhelmed with weapon malfunctions. For most, that would have ended their effectiveness as a marksman. But this soldier, a man whose name faded into anonymity after the war, refused to stop fighting. He found inspiration not in manuals or orders, but in memory. During training, instructors often spoke about aligning targets through instinct, how a shooter could feel a straight aim even without formal sights. That concept returned to him now, as he stared at the broken rifle resting across his knees. From a shattered supply crate, he pulled a length of coarse rope used for tying parachute bundles. He stretched it from the barrel to the buttstock, marking points of alignment through sheer judgment. The rope became a guide, crude but functional, a visual reference that compensated for the damaged optics. He cut and knotted it carefully, creating a makeshift frame that allowed him to gauge elevation and windage through repetition. It was absurdly simple, yet brilliant. A rope sight, born not from theory, but desperation. In a siege where even a single accurate shot could shift momentum, such innovation mattered. Nearby soldiers laughed when they first saw it, calling it superstition. But when his shots began landing precisely, German helmets snapping back through drifting snow, skepticism turned to silence. The rope sight worked. It wasn't a replacement for glass or steel. It was an extension of instinct, a bridge between man and machine under impossible pressure. While engineers and tacticians debated doctrine, this anonymous sniper quietly demonstrated that survival in Bastogne depended on invention as much as endurance. His crude adaptation became a whisper among the men, proof that in the cold, ingenuity was as lethal as any weapon. Outside, the siege reached its crescendo. German armor prepared for one final push, and the defenders of Bastogne, exhausted, starving, frozen, readied themselves for the storm that would decide their fate. The sniper adjusted his rope sight once more, testing its tension with gloved fingers. He didn't know that within hours, his invention would meet its defining moment, when the enemy came closer than ever before. War is often remembered through maps, arrows, and statistics. But inside Bastogne, survival had no blueprint. It was an equation of instinct, endurance, and trust. For the soldiers trapped there, every hour blurred into the next, marked not by time but by the number of shells that fell. The sniper's rope sight became more than a clever fix. It was a symbol of the human spirit that refused to break. When logic said it should, the men of the 101st Airborne had been trained for mobility, for parachute drops and rapid advances, not for static defense under siege. Yet here they were, surrounded, freezing, and cut off. The rope sight story spread quietly through the foxholes, an example of one man's refusal to yield to the impossible. Soldiers clung to these fragments of defiance. A single act of ingenuity became a small rebellion against despair. Every man in Bastogne faced a similar trial. Boots split from frostbite, rifles jammed, and skin stuck to frozen metal. But where one soldier might curse fate, another would tinker, modify, or repair. They carved handles from wood, lined gloves with scraps of parachute silk, melted snow in helmets to drink. The same hands that once jumped from aircraft at Normandy were now engineers of survival. The rope sight reminded them of something vital, that improvisation could be as decisive as courage. It became a quiet metaphor passed in whispers. If he can fix that rifle, we can hold this line. In a siege defined by scarcity, precision became the new firepower. Artillery could not be wasted. Ammunition could not be spared. Snipers like the rope sight marksmen turned this principle into art. From concealed windows and tree lines, they observed, waited, and struck with single, surgical shots. The environment was mercilessly still, snow muffled footsteps and gunfire alike. The wind carried sound in strange ways, distorting direction and distance. A sniper learned to breathe with the weather, to time each squeeze of the trigger between gusts. With the rope sight, aim was no longer mechanical, but intuitive. Each shot relied on the muscle memory of countless drills, adjusted by feel and experience. The German troops advancing through Bastogne's outskirts quickly learned to fear these unseen defenders. Patrols reported men falling silently, one by one, with no visible muzzle flash. The rope sight's user had turned a broken weapon into a ghost's instrument, striking without pattern or warning. It was psychological warfare of the most intimate kind. Personal, invisible, and absolute. For commanders, such sharpshooters were invaluable. They disrupted German movement, forced caution, and slowed assaults. A single sniper could halt an entire platoon's advance for hours. In Bastogne's cramped battlefields, where every house and hedgerow mattered, that delay often meant survival. No general ever truly commanded Bastogne. The winter did. Temperatures plunged below 20°C. The air itself became an adversary. Metal turned brittle, fuel froze, and the mere act of breathing hurt. In such conditions, every task became monumental. The cold shaped every sound, every motion. A rifle bolt slammed too loudly could betray a position. A breath could fog a scope and blind a shooter. The rope sight, ironically, solved one of those problems. It could not fog or freeze. It was immune to the elements because it wasn't metal or glass. It was rope. Frostbite became a greater threat than enemy bullets. Men wrapped their faces in scarves, their hands in cloth, but still, skin turned black beneath the frost. To move, to fight, to aim, it all required defiance against nature itself. And yet, amid that suffering, the soldiers found rhythm. They learned to listen to the cold, to sense when snow dampened sound enough to mask a shot, or when the cracking of ice warned of movement. Bastogne became a symphony of small noises, distant engines, shifting snow, the muted echo of rifles across white fields. Every soldier faced the same question. How long can we hold? Radio reports were sparse. Letters never arrived. Some began to doubt whether relief would come at all. Yet within that isolation, pride hardened. McAuliffe's nuts. Reply wasn't just a message. It became an emotional anchor. The men laughed when they heard it, because laughter meant defiance, and defiance meant life. The rope sight sniper embodied that mindset. His invention was a form of rebellion, a quiet nuts to physics and fate alike. Each successful shot whispered the same message. We are not beaten. It's easy to overlook the emotional endurance required to keep fighting under siege. Hunger gnawed constantly. The wounded groaned through sleepless nights. Artillery thunder became background noise, a reminder that safety didn't exist. But when soldiers saw one of their own adapt and fight back with creativity instead of despair, it rekindled something rare in war. Belief. Belief that resourcefulness could equal strength. Belief that even surrounded, they still had control. By late December, that belief mattered more than any weapon in the arsenal. As the siege tightened and the snow deepened, the rope sight's legend began to evolve. It wasn't merely about a single soldier anymore. It became a metaphor for the entire garrison. The ingenuity, the endurance, and the will to fight despite everything. But beyond morale, that invention would soon play a direct, tactical role in the coming clash, a moment when precision would decide life and death inside Bastogne's frozen walls. Warfare in World War II was a clash of machinery. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and mass production. But Bastogne was where technology failed. Radios froze. Engines stalled. Rifles cracked in the cold. Precision optics, designed in laboratories far from the front, became useless when exposed to the Ardennes' merciless winter. In that vacuum of reliability, innovation reverted to its purest form: human adaptation. The rope sight was not a product of industry. It was a battlefield evolution born from failure. Where engineers had no reach, a soldier's intuition filled the gap. The sniper's improvised sight represented something that modern warfare often forgets: that technology serves men, not the other way around. By aligning a strand of rope along his rifle's frame, he bypassed the fragile complexity of optics and rediscovered simplicity. Rope could stretch, bend, and freeze without shattering. It was an organic tool in an inorganic war. The method may have seemed primitive, yet it worked because it obeyed the oldest principles of marksmanship: alignment, consistency, and repetition. The human eye did the rest. In a world of steel and smoke, the rope sight was a quiet triumph of the human hand. Historians often debate how much such improvisations influenced outcomes. But in Bastogne, where the difference between a hit and a miss could decide whether a patrol survived, even a single adapted weapon mattered. The rope sight turned fragility into function, and in doing so, symbolized the broader truth of the American defense at Bastogne. Flexibility was power. General Anthony McAuliffe's defiant leadership has become legend. But true command in Bastogne wasn't delivered from headquarters. It was carried in whispers, gestures, and unspoken endurance across the lines. Officers and NCOs fought alongside their men, shared their rations, and froze in the same trenches. Leadership here wasn't about speeches. It was about visibility. The rope sight story, though small, spread among officers who saw its effect. It reminded them that discipline and creativity weren't opposites. They were complements. In an army often bound by procedure, Bastogne became a living laboratory of adaptation. When supply lines broke, McAuliffe's staff encouraged every man to make do. Mechanics turned wrecked jeeps into machine gun mounts. Radio operators rewired damaged field sets with copper scavenged from bombed houses. Medics improvised splints from furniture legs. The rope sight fit perfectly into that culture. A quiet act of initiative that inspired imitation. In the long nights between bombardments, platoon leaders used such stories to keep morale alive. If a sniper can rebuild his aim with rope, one sergeant told his men, then none of us have an excuse to give up. That kind of leadership, grounded in shared hardship and visible ingenuity, defined the 101st's defense. Bastogne didn't hold because of orders. It held because every man saw examples worth following. The sniper, though unknown in rank or name, became one of those examples. On the opposite side of the siege lines, German soldiers watched Bastogne with a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration. Their intelligence reports spoke of fanatisch amerikanische Widerstand, fanatical American resistance. Even after the surrender demand was rejected, German officers noted how snipers and small arms fire disrupted their patrols with uncanny precision. Some after-action reports describe a marksman who fired from unseen angles, whose shots struck officers during reconnaissance. Whether these references point to the rope sight sniper or others like him is uncertain, but the effect was the same: confusion, hesitation, and growing respect for the defender's tenacity. The Germans were veterans of the Eastern Front, accustomed to bitter conditions, yet even they were surprised by the Americans' adaptability. One captured Wehrmacht soldier reportedly remarked, "They fight with nothing, and they still fight." That statement, perhaps unknowingly, captured the moral essence of Bastogne. It wasn't about superiority of arms, it was about endurance of spirit. In retrospect, the rope sight became more than an improvisation. It became an allegory for the entire Bastogne defense, a fragile line, stretched to its limit, holding under unimaginable strain. The rope symbolized the bond between soldiers, the invisible threads of trust and faith that kept them from breaking. Every knot tied on that rifle represented a decision not to yield. Each adjustment made in darkness symbolized control amid chaos. The rope, a humble object of labor and logistics, transformed into an emblem of willpower. Long after the battle, surviving paratroopers would tell stories of how guys found ways to keep fighting, how one man's invention inspired many others to look differently at their tools, their surroundings, and themselves. Bastogne was full of such inventions. Socks turned into mittens, crates turned into barricades, parachutes into camouflage. But the rope sight carried poetry. It turned a broken thing into something reborn. It reminded men that no system, however perfect, replaces human will. Machines can fail, but resolve can improvise. By December 25th, the siege reached its breaking point. German attacks intensified as snow fell thicker and visibility shrank. Machine guns chattered through the fog. Mortars pounded the outer defenses. The defenders' lines bent but did not break. Inside the town, the sniper's rifle, rope-bound and steady, waited at a window overlooking a narrow street. Scouts reported movement. Enemy infantry creeping forward under cover of smoke. For the sniper, it was the moment when improvisation would meet necessity. The rope sight had worked in tests, in small exchanges, but this would be different. Close, chaotic, and critical. The air trembled with the sound of approaching armor. The siege was about to erupt into its most violent confrontation yet. The rope sight and the man behind it would soon prove whether human invention could truly stand against the machinery of war. December 25th, 1944, Bastogne. Christmas morning dawned under artillery fire. The snow that covered the town glowed faintly pink in the reflection of explosions. There were no hymns, no carols, only the slow, rhythmic hammer of German 88s echoing across the valley. Men crouched in foxholes and ruined houses, muttering quiet wishes for warmth, for food, for one more sunrise. Through that haze of smoke and frost, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division launched its largest assault yet. Infantry advanced behind tanks, pressing toward the southern perimeter near Marvy, and the roads leading into Bastogne's heart. The defenders were exhausted, ammunition nearly spent, rifles heavy with ice. In one of those positions, overlooking a narrow street choked with debris, the sniper readied his rifle. The rope sight stretched taut along the receiver, anchored by knots that marked his calibrated aim. He checked its alignment by memory, his breath steady despite the cold that bit through his gloves. Through the cracks of a broken window, he could see movement. Dark figures against the snow. German infantry, their outlines distorted by drifting smoke, were advancing cautiously between shell craters. The sniper's heart beat slowly. The world narrowed to a single corridor of vision. He pressed his cheek to the wooden stock. There was no magnification now, no glass, only rope, instinct, and discipline. The shot had to be perfect. The first trigger squeeze came with the precision of ritual. The rifle cracked, and a figure dropped into the snow. A second shot followed, then a third. The recoil jolted the weapon, but the rope sight held true. Each adjustment came from feel, fractions of angle, learned through repetition. Outside, chaos erupted. German troops dove for cover, uncertain where the shots were coming from. The sniper's comrades, inspired by his precision, joined the defense. Machine guns rattled from the neighboring house. The air filled with the scream of shells and the stutter of rifles. The assault intensified. A German Panzer IV rumbled into view, its treads grinding through the snow, its turret swiveling toward the sniper's block. The soldier exhaled, lowered his aim, and targeted the commander exposed in the open hatch. The rope sight aligned. The shot broke. The commander fell back inside the tank, and the machine froze mid-turn. confusion rippling through the advancing line. For a few crucial minutes, that delay saved the position. It gave the paratroopers time to reposition their bazookas and anti-tank guns. When the panzers tried again, American gunners were ready. A shell struck the lead tank's flank, erupting it in flame. The others hesitated, then reversed, retreating toward the woods. The sniper reloaded slowly, his fingers numb and trembling. Around him, the air smelled of gunpowder and burning fuel. Snowflakes drifted through the shattered window, settling on the rifle's barrel. He had no time to celebrate. The fight wasn't over. German mortars began to fall again, each explosion closer than the last. The house shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. One shell struck the roof, collapsing part of the upper floor. The sniper ducked under debris, clutching his weapon as timber splintered around him. When the barrage lifted, the street was silent. Too silent. Through the haze, he saw shapes moving again. 5, maybe 6 men, creeping low through the smoke. He steadied the rifle, adjusted the rope with quick precision, and fired. One went down. Another fell moments later. The rope sight wasn't magic. It was mastery. It depended on muscle memory and calm. It turned chaos into control. A lifeline drawn across the void between man and machine. Each knot on that rope represented hours of practice, faith, and instinct. By the time reinforcements arrived from a neighboring platoon, the sniper's position was nearly unrecognizable, shattered, burned, dusted in white ash. But the line had held. The German assault faltered once again, forced back toward the woods under constant fire. In the quiet that followed, the sniper lowered his rifle and looked at the rope, frayed slightly from recoil and smoke. He smiled faintly, not in triumph but in disbelief. Against reason, it had worked. Against everything that should have failed, it had endured. Later that day, when medics checked on the position, they found expended casings lined neatly beside the window, each one a silent record of defiance. The rope sight, charred, blackened, and nearly severed, remained tied in place. Elsewhere around Bastogne, the same story repeated in different forms. Paratroopers used makeshift mortars, repaired weapons, and improvised camouflage to hold the perimeter. The German offensive, once confident of breakthrough, now stalled. Each failed assault drained their strength and their faith. By December 26th, the siege was beginning to unravel. Elements of Patton's Third Army, having fought through snow and mud from the south, reached the outskirts of Bastogne. Relief was within sight. But for the defenders inside, it still felt like eternity. The sniper's actions that morning, small in scale but profound in effect, became part of that turning tide. His precision delayed an assault long enough for reinforcements to reposition, for wounded to be evacuated, for the line to breathe. No medal would record it, no citation would name it. Yet his ingenuity echoed through every soldier who saw it. The rope sight had transformed from a desperate fix into a symbol of resistance, proof that even stripped of technology, a soldier's resolve could still bend the outcome of war. The snow fell heavier that night, muting the sound of distant guns. Inside the town, men huddled by flickering lamps, whispering news of Patton's approach. The siege wasn't over, but the tide had begun to shift. And somewhere in a ruined building, a sniper rested his weapon across his lap, the rope still tied in place, frayed, blackened, but unbroken. The battle's decisive moment was near. December 26, 1944, Bastogne's southern edge. The morning began like every other in the siege, gray, bitter, and brittle with frost. But beyond the fog, a new sound crept through the valley, the deep rumble of engines that didn't belong to the enemy. Men lifted their heads from foxholes, uncertain. Could it finally be true? Hours earlier, under cover of darkness, Patton's Third Army had punched through the German encirclement from the south. Columns of Sherman tanks and armored infantry, were grinding their way up the frozen road toward Bastogne. But the Germans, desperate to maintain their ring, launched one final counterattack to crush the pocket before relief arrived. For the defenders inside the town, that meant another day of chaos, another test of will. The sniper took position once again, his rifle still bound with its rope sight. The previous day's assault had nearly destroyed his position. Half the roof was gone and walls were riddled with holes. But from those gaps, he could now see the faint outlines of German armor maneuvering through the mist. The town's defenders prepared in silence. Bazooka teams checked their launchers, machine gunners reloaded, and medics waited in cellars, ready for another wave of casualties. The smell of smoke never left the air. It clung to uniforms, to skin, to every breath. At 0900 hours, the Germans struck. Tanks roared forward through the haze, their treads churning slush into black mud. Infantry followed close behind, shouting, firing, advancing in disciplined waves. The Americans responded with every weapon still functional. Mortars burst among the attackers, shredding formations. The rattle of machine guns mixed with the sharp, deliberate cracks of rifles. From his ruined window, the sniper found his first target. A machine gun crew setting up in the open. The rope sight aligned perfectly. One shot, one fall. He shifted aim by instinct, fired again, then again. The rhythm returned, mechanical and calm. But this assault was heavier, closer, relentless. The sniper's building shook as tank rounds exploded nearby. He could hear the whistle of ricochets slicing through air, the thunder of collapsing masonry. Dust coated his gloves, but his focus never broke. A nearby paratrooper shouted over the din, "They're breaking through!" The sniper glanced, saw movement to the right, a squad of Germans pushing toward a gap in the line. He pivoted, steadied, and began firing with controlled precision. Each shot delayed them, scattering their advance. Through his peripheral vision, he caught sight of something in the distance. A faint shimmer of light on armor, moving fast through the tree line. It was unfamiliar, then suddenly clear. Shermans. American Shermans. The roar grew louder. From the southern road, elements of the 37th Tank Battalion broke through. Guns blazing, their white star insignias barely visible beneath layers of mud and ice. The relief column had arrived. For the first time in days, cheers erupted along the American lines. Soldiers shouted, cried, and fired their weapons skyward in defiance. The siege, surrounded for 7 brutal days, was finally broken. Yet even as relief came, the fight refused to fade quietly. German artillery retaliated, desperate to seal the breach. Shells screamed overhead. One exploded near the sniper's building, sending debris flying. The rope sight trembled but held. He steadied his weapon for what might be his last volley. He saw German troops retreating through the smoke, abandoning their wounded. He tracked one last target, squeezed the trigger, and the rifle jammed. The rope sight had done its duty, but the weapon itself had finally succumbed. The cold, the dirt, the endless recoil. It was finished. The sniper set it down gently beside him, breathing hard. Outside, the thunder of Patton's armor rolled closer. American infantry poured in behind, faces gaunt but grinning. The first tanks to reach Bastogne bore painted words on their hulls. "Merry Christmas," scrawled by crews who'd driven through hell to get there. The defenders emerged from their positions, snow and soot caked to their faces. Some wept openly. Others simply stared at the approaching columns, unsure if they were still dreaming. The siege that had seemed eternal was finally over. When the guns quieted that evening, Bastogne lay in ruins. Buildings smoldered. Streets were choked with debris and frozen corpses. The smell of cordite hung in the air like a memory. But amid the devastation, there was silence, the kind that comes only after unthinkable noise. The sniper walked the perimeter slowly, his rifle slung over his shoulder. the rope still tied in place. Fellow paratroopers nodded to him as he passed, unaware of how many lives his invention might have saved. For him, there was no celebration, only exhaustion and the strange disbelief that he was still alive. Historians would later describe Bastogne as a victory of logistics, courage, and leadership. They would quote McAuliffe's defiance, Patton's rapid maneuver, the air resupply. But they could never quite capture the smaller truths, the human inventions that kept the line intact when everything else failed. Somewhere in those frozen ruins, the sniper found a brief moment of stillness. He untied the rope from his rifle, coiled it in his palm, and placed it in his pocket. To him, it wasn't a relic of battle. It was a reminder of necessity, that even when the world collapses, the mind can still build. That night, as the men huddled around fires for the first time without fear of encirclement, someone began to sing faintly, a broken tune of home. The sound spread slowly, carried across the battered town. For the first time since the siege began, Bastogne was no longer a prison. Above them, the snow fell again, softer now, almost gentle. And beneath that silence, the rope sight's legend began its quiet journey into history. A story passed between soldiers, then through decades, as proof that even in war's darkest winter, ingenuity could still shine like light through smoke. When the sun rose over Bastogne on December 27, 1944, the siege was over, but the cost lay everywhere. The once quiet Belgian town had been turned into a skeleton of ash and snow. Shattered walls leaned like broken teeth. Burned-out tanks marked where the fiercest clashes had raged. In the center square, paratroopers wandered through wreckage in silence, dazed not by victory, but by the weight of survival. The 101st Airborne Division, which had held Bastogne for 7 days without surrender, was unrecognizable. Many men limped on frost-bitten feet wrapped in rags. Some had gone days without food or sleep. Medics moved among them, checking pulses, covering faces. What had once been 11,000 defenders was now a fraction of that number, but still standing. General Anthony McAuliffe, the man whose single word, nuts, had become legend, walked through the ruins quietly. He shook hands with soldiers, offered brief nods of acknowledgement, and spoke little. The victory was already being celebrated at headquarters far behind the lines. But for those who had lived through the encirclement, celebration felt distant. The roads around Bastogne were littered with wreckage. Dozens of German tanks smoldered in the snow, their crews frozen where they fell. Abandoned weapons, bloodied uniforms, and torn field maps told the story of a battle fought at the edge of endurance. American engineers began clearing mines and repairing the main routes, a monumental task, as every path out of Bastogne was choked with destruction. For the sniper, the end of the siege brought no rest. His rifle had finally broken beyond repair. The metal was warped, the chamber cracked. He turned it in to the ordnance depot without ceremony, the rope sight still tied in place. The armorer examined it with a curious look, muttering, "Hell of an idea." But paperwork didn't record improvisations. Within days, both rope and rifle disappeared into the machinery of war. Still, whispers spread. Soldiers who had seen the strange contraption spoke about it to others. They described how the sniper's accuracy had held the flank when all seemed lost, how he'd turned a ruined weapon into a tool of precision. The tale grew with each retelling, crossing units, morphing into legend. Some said the rope sight became a prototype idea studied by small arms engineers later in the war. Others insisted it was forgotten entirely, buried beneath thousands of similar acts of ingenuity that defined the human side of combat. In the broader campaign, the relief of Bastogne marked a critical shift. Hitler's last great offensive in the West, the Ardennes counteroffensive, was unraveling. Patton's rapid maneuver had broken the encirclement faster than German command believed possible. By early January, Allied forces were pressing the enemy back toward the Siegfried Line. What began as a desperate gamble for the Reich had ended in catastrophic loss. Nearly 100,000 German casualties, thousands of vehicles destroyed, and no strategic gain. Yet the victory at Bastogne was more than numbers or maps. It became a symbol of endurance, of defiance, of the power of improvisation in the face of chaos. Reporters arriving after the battle wrote of the town that would not die. War correspondents from Stars and Stripes and Time described scenes of men still clutching frozen rifles, boots black with soot, eyes hollow but steady. The 101st had not just survived. They had set an example of what unbreakable resolve looked like. In the days that followed, reinforcements poured in, bringing supplies, food, and blankets. Trucks rolled through the ruined streets, distributing coffee and cigarettes. Chaplains held brief services among the ruins, their prayers carried by the wind. Snow continued to fall, softening the scars of battle, but never hiding them completely. For the sniper and others like him, the war was far from over. Within weeks, the 101st Airborne was redeployed north to drive the Germans out of the Ardennes entirely. But the memory of Bastogne, the hunger, the cold, the silence between artillery shells, stayed with them forever. Years later, historians would call Bastogne the epitome of American grit. But beneath that phrase were countless untold stories of mechanics fashioning tank parts from scrap, of medics using parachute silk as bandages, and of a single soldier who used a rope to restore his aim when everything else failed. Because Bastogne wasn't won by numbers alone. It was won by human endurance, by men who refused to surrender to weather, hunger, or despair. Each improvised act, no matter how small, became a thread in a larger story. The resilience of the human will under pressure no machine could replicate. And though the sniper's name never appeared in reports or commendations, his rope sight became part of Bastogne's silent legend, a small, invisible symbol of the ingenuity that defined that frozen victory. By the first week of January 1945, Bastogne had transformed from a battlefield into a hospital. Every basement, barn, and schoolroom filled with wounded men. The snow outside was still red in places, and the roads echoed with the slow clatter of stretchers. Engineers cleared mines while medical trucks rumbled toward the rear. The war had moved east, but its shadow lingered here, over every ruin, every grave. The Battle of the Bulge was ending. What began as Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied line had instead bled his forces dry. Nearly 600,000 Allied troops had fought across the Ardennes. Over 80,000 were killed, wounded, or missing. But it was the German army that suffered the fatal blow, losing men and equipment it could never replace. The Eastern Front would soon collapse under Soviet pressure. Bastogne, though just one small Belgian town, had become the pivot of an entire war's direction. American command quickly recognized its symbolic power. War correspondents were brought in to photograph the ruins, to show the world what defiance looked like. McAuliffe's nuts. Reply was reprinted on posters and newspapers across the U.S., turning Bastogne into a rallying cry for endurance. Yet, behind the mythology, soldiers who had lived through the siege struggled with quieter truths. They remembered the hunger first, the way their stomachs cramped so hard it hurt to move. They remembered the silence after shell fire, the smell of burning fuel, and the screams of men calling for medics who would never come. And they remembered how, amid that chaos, survival depended not just on courage, but on creativity, the ability to solve the unsolvable with what little they had. That's what the rope sight represented. It was not just an invention. It was a state of mind. In a place where equipment froze, optics shattered, and supplies vanished, A soldier had refused to surrender to circumstance. He turned what was available, rope, instinct, muscle memory, into precision. And in doing so, he reminded every man who saw him that ingenuity was the difference between despair and resistance. After Bastogne, U.S. ordnance officers began quietly collecting field innovations. Reports from frontline units described makeshift repairs, customized sites, and improvised camouflage methods. Engineers studied them for potential post-war applications. Though no official record of a rope site survives, the broader principle, adapting through necessity, would shape later doctrines in small arms training, especially within airborne and ranger units. For the sniper himself, the war continued through Germany's final collapse. Some say he fought through the Ruhr and into Bavaria before being rotated home in mid-1945. Others believe he never left Europe, part of the occupation forces who watched the ruins of the Third Reich crumble into dust. His name, lost to history, became secondary to what he represented: the countless anonymous soldiers who turned improvisation into art. When the war ended that spring, Bastogne became a pilgrimage site. Villagers returned to rebuild their homes. Graves were marked, monuments raised. Each year, veterans of the 101st Airborne would return, standing silently in the cold fields where they once fought. Among them were engineers, medics, gunners, and, perhaps, somewhere, that unnamed sniper. None of them sought glory. Their eyes spoke of something quieter: remembrance. Time changed the landscape. Roads were paved, ruins rebuilt, and battlefields softened by grass. Yet the forest still whispered of that winter. Metal detectors still found cartridge casings, fragments of helmets, rusted rifles, and once in a while, a piece of rope, hardened and frayed, surfaced from the soil, silent witness to the ingenuity that had once defied the impossible. In military academies decades later, Bastogne was studied not only as a tactical case but as a lesson in morale. Commanders emphasized how leadership, logistics, and improvisation intertwined, how even small acts of problem-solving could alter outcomes when formal systems failed. The rope sight became an unrecorded metaphor, passed in conversations among instructors. When the scope breaks, find another way to see. That was Bastogne's deeper truth. That victory in war is not only about superior numbers or weapons, but about the minds that refuse to stop adapting. As Europe thawed and peace returned, Bastogne's legacy settled into memory. The fields where the 101st fought are now quiet, dotted with memorials. Tourists visit the town, tracing the outlines of foxholes beneath the trees. They read plaques honoring generals and divisions. But somewhere in that silence lies another story. One not carved in marble, but written in ingenuity. Because history often remembers the speeches, the strategies, the medals. Yet the real war lived in the small things: a rope tied to a rifle, a candle in a cellar, a soldier's steady breath through freezing air. Those were the details that kept Bastogne alive when logic said it should have died. War often remembers its grand victories: the sweeping offensives, the famous speeches, the generals who shaped strategy. But its true soul lives in smaller, quieter moments. Moments when survival depends on thought rather than orders, on imagination rather than instruction. At Bastogne, surrounded by cold and steel, men learned that the human mind was the last weapon left when everything else broke. The rope sight became a symbol of that truth. It was not a marvel of engineering or a breakthrough of science. It was simply an act of refusal. A man refusing to give up the power to see, to aim, to fight. In that frozen siege, when the world seemed to be collapsing inward, a length of rope turned desperation into accuracy. That act mirrored the entire defense of Bastogne itself: fragile, improvised, yet unyielding. It showed that even amid the machinery of modern war, human creativity still mattered. The anonymous sniper never wrote memoirs, never appeared in newsreels, but his invention outlived him in spirit, retold in whispers, remembered by those who saw it, and carried forward as part of the invisible architecture of history. Because not every hero is recorded. Not every innovation is recognized. Some live only as echoes in the minds of those who understood what it meant to adapt when failure was certain. When historians walk through Bastogne today, they speak of McAuliffe's defiance, Patton's tanks, the encirclement broken by sheer endurance. But somewhere beneath those stories lies another truth, that victory is often born from simplicity. A man, a rope, a rifle, and the will to make them work together when reason said they shouldn't. In the end, the rope sight stands as more than an artifact of war. It represents what defines humanity itself, the instinct to create under pressure, to build from ruin, to find clarity through chaos. Bastogne was not just held by courage, it was held by invention. And that is how legends are made, not through glory, but through the quiet brilliance of those who refuse to stop thinking in the darkest winter of all.